Hello, this is the Grove Street Lodger, and I wasn't going to do this right now. It's getting late, but I just wanted to feel like I achieved something today. This is my usual winter wear, to be honest. This is a llama wool poncho from Ecuador. Some friends gave me with some swirls on it that makes it look a little bit like a Time Lord made it. Yeah, it's not been the best of evenings. My chair's broken. It's my only chair, and the phlegm, which was running clear, is now running yellow again. So, hey, uh, let's go with some books. So, the first book I read was The Lancashire Witches by William Harrison Ainsworth. Um, I actually started this last month, and I was about halfway through it, and I finished it off at the beginning of this. Now, I love a bit of William Harrison Ainsworth, and I feel a bit sorry for him because he started really well. He was sort of a rat pack with Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens, and he was the successful one. He came right off the block with two books, Rookwood and Jack Sheppard, see, um, which really cemented his name and made him big. But they were both Newgate novels, and very, very shortly after Jack Sheppard came out, the Newgate novel received a moral panic, and these books were seen as immoral and dangerous. And he had to sort of shift into historical novelling, which he's very good at it, but he never quite got his knack again. I love him. He's not as good as Dickens as a writer, because Dickens just has this flair. He just loves words. You almost get this picture of him just enjoying what these words are doing on the page. Wilkie Collins is. Oh, I read him the other month. He was really good. I haven't quite fixed his skill yet, but William Harrison Ainsworth's sort of big skill is visuals and set pieces. As long as his characters aren't talking, the books are really, really good. Because he's got this. You almost think he'd have been brilliant for silent film or something, because he's got this visual flair, and he has enough skill with words to communicate it into text. And The Lancashire Witches was the only book of his that is still in print, except for print on demand. And I don't actually know if that's true, because I mean this copy, which is the newest one I found, was published in the 70s. Maybe Wordsworth do a copy of Lancashire Witches or something. I don't know. And it's based on the Pendle Witch Trials. And one of my really, really good friends claims that he is descended from Old Mother Demdike, the leader of the Pendle Witches. I'm not sure what he'd say about this book, because in this book, Old Mother Demdike is the daughter of a man who sold his soul to Satan, a monk indeed who sold his soul to Satan, and has been cursed as a baby by an archbishop. So, or a bishop. So yeah, so she's this witch, and there's a really weird tension in this book, because if you were writing a book now about the Lancashire witches, you'd say that it was I don't know, you'd say poor women who were terribly put upon and murdered, and all the ire would be on the lawyers and the people that tried them. And William Harrison Ainsworth does this. You know, the lawyer is made to look like an idiot, and the landowner who sort of brings it to trial, Roger Nowell, he's this cruel, vindictive man. He's not a very good landlord. So it all does heavily stack against the side who are prosecuting the witches. But because William Harrison Ainsworth loves a bit of gothic, and he loves a bit of drama, and he loves a bit of ludicrousness, they're real witches. They do Eye of Newt spells. They fly on broomsticks. They cackle. They go ha ha. They have boils on the end of their noses. They have familiars with silly names who do things for them. You know, they have a contract with the devil. So these are real murderous, evil witches. And so no one's quite in the right. There's always this weird tension. Because you're not really on the side of the witches because they're evil, but you're definitely not on the side of the prosecutors because they're, well, twats, you know, they're prosecuting witches. And in the middle of it, there's Alison Device, who in the real history was the sort of instigator of the whole thing. She cursed someone who then had a stroke. And she obviously believed she had cursed him because she admitted it, and she was really, really penitent about it. She was really sorry. But in this, Alison Device is this sort of almost perfect sort of, Victorian ingenue type figure who whose personal goodness protects them from the witches, even though she's surrounded by them, including her evil sister Janet. And Janet is this horrible, nasty character in this. And Janet is actually a 9-year-old girl who testified against her mum, sister, and brother, and had them hanged for being witches in real life, and was later tried for being a witch later, and got off it, but may have died in prison. It's a bit mysterious about how Janet died. And so this is a really fun book, but it's got this weird tension at all times between the legal and the witchy. It's split into chunks, and each chunk takes about 48 hours. Each chunk's really different. The prologue's very gothic novel inspired. There's a monk locked in an inescapable prison, very the monk. Like Matthew Lewis is the monk kind of thing, and he sells his soul to the devil to get out, and he has powers, and he's fighting with this bishop who is fighting against Henry VIII, trying to take away all the abbeys and things, and that's all pretext, it's all prologue. The next section is all about May Day celebrations, and it brings our romantic lovers together, and it sets up everybody, and it's okay. But the third chunk's the really, really good one, because it's like this descent into darkness. They get further and further closer to Pendle Hill, to the centre of the witches and the badness, and they see the pain and the suffering and just the general evil witchiness of it all. And it gets more and more intense into a big climax on Pendle Hill. And then there's a fourth section, which is all about King James coming, and it sort of ties that all up. And that bit's a bit rubbish. He's really good at research, but the research isn't very well digested in that last section. There's just lots of lists of famous people and things like that. He's obviously got hold of the banquet record, so he lists all the food, for example. And this is the source of that thing of King James knighting some beef and calling it sirloin, where we get sirloin steak from. It's called the sirloin because it's beneath the loin, French. But this is where that story comes from, and this is where ideas of British people burning witches comes from, because that's how a lot of the witches die in this, and that's not how British people dealt with witches. And a lot of our modern myths come from this book, or were exacerbated by this book. Same with our highwayman myths. A lot of those come from Rookwood, all the Dick Turpin stuff. And I think that really speaks to William Harrison Ainsworth as someone who can make things that resonate to the extent that they're now almost seen as history by some people, or by people who haven't looked into it. They're the folk history. And it's fun, and it's rocking, and it's rollicking, and it's fat. And the last chunk is a little bit meh, but it's really good. So I went from that, I thought, let's not go lighter. Let's go Jan Potocki, the manuscript found in Saragossa. Saragossa? I get this out of the way first. Jan Potocki made a silver bullet out of his silver sugar dish, had a priest bless it, and shot himself and killed himself with it. He may have thought he was becoming a werewolf. And this book is nuts. I knew it was nuts. That's the only thing I knew about it, really. There's the outside frame story of finding the manuscript. But then once we get in there, we don't leave that frame. It's all about this guy called Alphonse, who's a Walloon, and he's been brought up in very, very strict military version of honour. And so he won't tell a lie, but he will keep a secret if he's asked to, especially by women. And he's very touchy about honour and about veracity and things like this. And so the blurb made it look like he went into the Sierra Morena and he went to an inn and he couldn't leave and he heard all these stories. But that's not what happens. His frame story is actually really interesting. He goes to this area, Sierra Morena, which is supposed to be just filled with ghosts and magicians and gypsies and Muslims and just outcasts of all kinds, and just the odds and ends of society seem in this area, including, spiritual odds and ends, things that shouldn't really exist happen here. And he meets two women who claim to be his cousin. and they're Muslim, and they said that he's in the Christian branch of the family, they're in the Muslim branch, and they both want to become his wife because they had a childhood without any men. They grew to very much enjoy each other's company, and they want to share a husband, and they want him because he's related to them, so he carries their bloodline, and they want him to become a Muslim. He's like, well, I won't become a Muslim, but okay. And they go, well, don't tell anyone about us. And then he wakes up under these two hanged men. And for the first third of the book, quarter of the book, a chunk of the book, he keeps trying to get away from this area. He keeps meeting people, and then he keeps meeting these girls and waking up under the hanged men. And you get this impression that, because the way he wakes up, he's not just waking up under them, he's waking up entwined with them. And then he's hearing stories about other people who have met them and who are waking up entwined with them. And you get this impression that he's essentially had a incestual, gay, necrophiliac threesome, which has levels of diabolism in it. You know, these succubi have infested these skeletons and are shagging him and pretending that they're something they're not. But because he's promised he won't tell anyone, even when they tell him similar stories about their experiences with these things, he won't say. And then it drifts off and he meets this gypsy king, and the gypsy king is like the controller of stories. He then tells stories, and some of the stories he tells have stories in, and stories in them, and stories in them, and you get six deep in stories. And because he can't sustain the story because he's got to go and do business, someone else might come and tell a story, and then he'll come back and tell the story in the story in the story, and then he'll go away and somebody else will carry on with their story, or maybe their story in their story, and it all gets very interlocked, but it never gets confusing. And it's really good, because all these stories are pretty interesting. They start quite gothic. Ooh. Sorry about that. They start quite gothic and grim, and then they become like amateur tales. They become like love stories and love farces and love comedies. And then the supernatural kind of returns, but it always returns as farce. So there's a story earlier on where this person, his friend's about to fight a duel, and he says, "I'll come back to you and I'll tell you if purgatory exists, and if I'm dead, I'll tell you if purgatory exists." And that night, the man hears noises and he flings open his window and says, "Are you dead?" And he gets back the voice, "Yes." He goes, "Are you in purgatory?" And he gets back, "Yes." And he panics because he hasn't really considered purgatory, and he runs off and becomes a monk for a while. And then later on, we hear of somebody else's story where he's climbing up a ladder to get to his lover, but has got the wrong window, and the window shutters flung into his face, knocked him down, and a voice is called out, "Are you dead?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I feel it." And then the voice said, "Are you in purgatory?" And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm in purgatory." And it's all been a fake. And yeah, so if you don't want spoilers for this book, and they are spoilers, you don't want to go into the book knowing this, so skip to the next book if you ever plan to read it, and I recommend you do. The whole thing, the whole frame story has been a test for Alphonse, because he is actually the Christian wing of this Muslim family, and there's a literal Muslim underground of Shiites called the run by the Sheikh of Qasar Gomeles, and they've been testing him, and they've been testing his honesty by staging these events, and then by getting people to tell him these stories. And the whole thing, I mean, he meets the Wandering Jew, but it's not, it's an actor pretending to be the Wandering Jew. And in fact, my favourite character called Pachenko, who is this man who says he was attacked by demons and they ripped out his eye and licked his brain and then played his leg like a guitar, is actually just an acrobat with one eye who's been pretending. And it's all been to test him to see if he's worthy, one, of becoming the Sheikh, and he's not because he won't become a Muslim, but two, worthy of fathering sons who will then carry on the line, which he is, so he gets to shag the two sisters. Yeah, very strange book, and one that might, it might be good for a reread if you know where it's going then, to see, oh, well, the clues are. It's very interesting because the introduction suggested that maybe he wanted to write a gothic novel and then sort of change his mind. But I think there's a really clear progression of disillusionment as it goes on. It starts off all magical, and then each story becomes less magical, and then they become anti-magical until he gets his revelations. So I think it was all kind of set up, to be honest. Even if it's a bit disappointing, all the fun, ghosty stuff didn't happen. Yeah, it's a really good book. People say it's like Decameron, which I've got but I haven't read, or Canterbury Tales, but I think it's more like the first book of Don Quixote, because Don Quixote, the first book, has the interpolated novels, and all the stories are a bit like that. But also, this whole thing of Alphonse the Walloon is kind of like a knight errant going across this desert. It's very good. I followed that up with Hermsprong by not by Pamela Perkins. She was the editor, and there was good notes in this. But by Robert Bage, or Robert Bargy, who was he ran a paper mill just outside Birmingham, and he wrote a few novels, and this was one of his later ones, maybe his last one. And the blurb says it's a political comedy about a guy called Hermsprong who was raised by American natives, and he comes to England, and because of his upbringing, he has a completely different view on the world, and he argues with people. And I thought this might be a bit fun but a bit dry, because I was imagining, okay, we'll find out about his parents, and then where he was raised by natives, and then we'll follow him, and he'll have arguments with people, and some of these arguments will be fun, and some of them won't. It's not set up like that at all. We introduce this completely different character who narrates it, who's really cool. He's called Gregory Glenn, and he has his own ludicrous adventure at the beginning, in which he decides to drown himself in the sea, and is caught on the way and basically laughed out of it, because like you're not dying for love. You'll meet other people. Come on, get over it. And so Gregory Glenn sort of retires because he's the bastard son of someone, and the someone's essentially said, if you live a long way away from me, I'll give you money. And so he lives quite comfortably in this little village. And we introduced a little village, and it's almost like a sitcom, because we know all the characters of the village. We know the lord of the manor, we know his sycophantic priest, and his lawyer, and we know his daughter who lives with the aunt. We know all these different characters. And then Hermsprong comes and stirs it all up. And so Hermsprong is the most boring character in it, because he's upright and he's faithful, and he doesn't have a lot of fun to him, really. But his effect on everyone else is enormous fun. And it's a really genuinely funny book, and it's written really sharply, and there's elements of stern in it. The narrator sort of has imaginary interlocutors who come and argue with him, like, come on, get a move on. We weren't paying you for a bunch of character setups. Get some story going, and don't go on a digression now, and all this kind of stuff. It's really, really enjoyable and really silly and really fun, and the characters are great. And there is a certain character called Mrs. Fluart, or Flirt. I mean, she certainly is a flirt. She uses her flirting techniques to get out of problems. And also, she's best friends with the slightly less interesting, female love interest character. And Flirt brings attention to herself when she knows it's going to be uncomfortable to the main character there. And she's really, really cool, and she maintains her own, and by the end of it, she's still single, and just winding Hermsprong up with her humour. And she's really funny, and the narrator's really funny, and there's lots of great stuff in it. And I've never heard of Hermsprong. I picked it up from a second-hand bookshop and just went, oh, it's Broadview, that'll be interesting. And it was great, and I recommend Hermsprong, which I didn't think I was going to. Now, the last full book I read, not many this month, was Coelebs in Search of a Wife. And I read this, it's by Hannah More, the noted supporter of good causes. She was, for the abolition of slavery. She was for education of women. She set up Sunday schools. Good causes. But she wrote this one novel, and I read it almost as a dare, because when we did our tour of Bath, we went to all these different writers' houses, and they'd be going, oh, this is where Anne Radcliffe lived. Anyone read any Anne Radcliffe? And I'd be like, yeah. And then we got to Hannah More, and anyone read her novel? No one, not even me. So I was challenged to read it. especially because it was supposed to be long and boring. It's about this guy called Coelebs. He's in search of a wife. He goes to London. He meets a few wives who aren't suitable, and then he meets one who is, gets to know her. The end. That plot is actually more interesting than what happens in this book, because Coelebs doesn't really search for a wife. Plot twist, and actually, I wouldn't even skip this one. He's basically been set up with this woman, Lucilla, since before he was born. When he's dying, Dad says, "Go check on my mate Stanley." It's because he's already knows that Stanley has been bringing up his daughter Lucilla to be the perfect man for a perfect wife for the man that Coelebs has been brought up to be. So there's not really that. Also, when he's in search for a wife, he doesn't pay any attention to the women. He pays attention to their mums. He spends all the time thinking about their mums and about education and stuff. And what this book really is all these characters talking about religion for pages and pages and pages and pages and pages and pages, 400 pages. It's very, very dull. And the main sort of paragon is Mr. Stanley, and he's supposed to be the best of all Christians. He's supposed to believe deeply in the tenets of faith, but also act Christian, with charity and that. A lot of the other characters essentially fall between these two stools. They're either very, very charitable, but don't have any deep faith that drives it, or they have a deep faith that doesn't lead them to do things. But he balances them both, and he's supposed to be perfect, really, but he's horrible. He's this self-opinionated arsehole who just slathers his opinion on everyone else, has been forcing it on his children and been forcing his wife. I mean, Lucilla's a bit of a wet wet doormat, so she's sort of gone along with it. But he's got a younger daughter called Phoebe, who's obviously a bit more sprightly, because they keep saying how they have to punish her more, because she might go off the wrong path and, enjoy life. It's just... I've heard it said that this novel, which was very, very popular at its time, put feminist thinking back, and I can see how this argument comes about, because you've got the original feminist thinkers who are all about education, that, if we believe Locke, that all humans are born blank slates, then the intellectual differences in humans, race, poverty level, gender, all come from education. So all we need to do is educate women like men, and they will be as functional as men. And what she's saying is, no, that's terrible. Women should be at the home and they should be supporting their husbands, and but we need to educate them to do that. And her schools were mocked by other leading sort of school founders for not being all that useful. She didn't teach, for example, the children in her schools to write, because they wouldn't need it. They need enough reading that they could read improving works. They need enough maths that they could do household accounts, but they wouldn't need to write because they'd have nothing worth saying. And it's how the mainstream take in, defang these original ideas, and then they're okay, and then they're safe. And this book is part of that. How it was ever popular, I have no idea. There's no dramatic interest in it. He doesn't search for a wife. He just sees some people and then sees some other people, and he's settled with this one all along, and it's so dull. It's really, really boring. So I was dared to read it, and I read it, and it was just as dull as I was promised it would be. And that's the end of what I've read this month. I'm not saying it took ages because of Coelebs so much, but I had a 600, I had a 500, I had a 400, and another 400. It was a lot of words in few books, I suppose. The other thing I've read, which isn't properly... So this is the selected essays of Samuel Johnson, and I read some selected essays in these selected essays for a meeting of the Johnson Society. And originally I was going to read all the Johnson essays, but I've read them all before, and I didn't want to confuse the ones I'd read that we weren't intended to read. I wanted to stick to the ones, that were the ones everyone else has read, so I just read those. Actually, it's a great way of reading Johnson. And it was a real good reminder of how sprightly and lively and interesting Johnson is after I read Hannah More. So there you go. December, I'm starting with Les Mis. It's big and it's beastly and it's very, very good so far. And I think that should take up most of the month. But considering how good it is, it might end a little quicker. So I don't know where we're going to go after that. But there you go. Happy winter. May you all be cheerfully choking on your own phlegm and shivering in your house and trying not to lean back on your chair because it's broken. Enjoy.